Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 329 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory, and joining me again today is the wonderful Susie Jamieson. Susie is an experienced integrative therapist, qualified in person-centered therapy, cognitive behavioural therapy, transactional analysis, EFT tapping, breathwork and somatic awareness. Beyond her therapeutic expertise, Susie is also a coach known as the Complaints Counsellor, offering invaluable support to professionals who have been subject to a complaint. Today, she is here to share insights into 3 lectures she has created for the Counsellor CPD Library, titled Coping with a Complaint. If you want to understand the process of becoming complaint ready, what it means and why it matters, and how you can navigate it with confidence, then this is the conversation for you. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ken.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and a very warm welcome to episode 329 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Both Rory Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly, are delighted to welcome you to our 3 topics today, starting with ethical sustainable practice, where today we're going to be speaking about PTS versus CPTS. It's going to be an interesting one. Deliberately leaving off the D's there. You'll make more sense when we get to that in just a moment. We're then going to practice matters, where it's, as Rory has introduced, Susie Jamieson is going to be speaking about how to navigate complaints. This is an important one. It's always a good idea to think about navigating complaints, not when you have one, but way in advance of what might you do in that kind of a situation. And then we move on to student services, where today we're going to be speaking about something that I think is applies to many of the students, certainly when we were teaching, Rory, and we see a lot talking about it in our Facebook group, and that is the overwhelm that can come specifically around doing observed skills sessions. So we're going to be speaking about that. But starting us off, that ethical sustainable practice, PTS versus CPTS, Rory, over to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Ken. So those acronyms, in case you're thinking, well, what is Ken discussing here? What is he talking about? PTS, formerly known as PTSD, is post-traumatic stress. And I'm going to bracket the disorder because in more recent and enlightened times, we realise that post-traumatic stress is a natural response to an unnatural situation. And the idea it's disordered is a bit... it's a bit disadvantageous to those people who are experiencing it. Not only do they have post-traumatic stress, but they're also considered disordered. So I think most modern practitioners would drop the D, and CPTS brackets D is continual post-traumatic stress, where people have been subject to a number of stressful events. But before I go a little bit deeper into that and talk about how CPTS came into existence, I just want us to think a little bit about 20th century therapy. So if we think about it, Carl Ransom Rogers, who a lot of you will have studied, and in fact a lot of the other theorists like Eric Berne and Aaron Beck, were all 20th century therapists, and they drew roughly from experience. Rogers drew from phenomenology, the idea of your lived experience, quite a topical discussion point now in our society. Eric Berne talked about our experiences of growing through childhood, and Aaron Beck talked about our experiences of our thinking and how sometimes our thinking gets it wrong. But none of that was rooted in any form of biology. It was all philosophical. In other words, there was no discussion about how the body reacted. And in 1987, Carl Rogers died. He died in San Diego, California. And only, I think about 4 years before he died, was PTSD in the clinical manuals, where it was a cluster of symptoms where people would have post-traumatic stress. And what happened was, from the 80s, when we moved into the new millennia, we became, as therapists, more informed on physiology, on biology, on the way the body processes trauma. And you had a whole host of people who came into the therapy arena who talked not of just only their experience, but also the physiological change that trauma has on the body. And I'm going to make this point, I'm going to make it really clear. A lot of the teaching that's still done here in the UK focuses on 20th century ideas. I recently did a poll in our Facebook group. If you want to go to our Facebook group, just go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, you'll find this. And I asked, how many people during their UK training, and are we talking from level 4, or should I say diploma, to respect our friends in Scotland, right up to master's level, had ever been taught anything about trauma in their studies? And 100 people responded, and only 7 were confident that the training they took in their first trainings would support someone who had post-traumatic stress. And I make a further point. The presentations of people with post-traumatic stress have gone through the roof. I trained in the beginning of the millennium. I qualified in 2004. So I was one of those students who straddled the 20th and the 21st century. I never thought of it until I was putting my thinking together for the podcast today. And my presentation, which I did with a wonderful man called Jonathan Knowles, I hope you're listening, Jonathan, was on post-traumatic stress. And I can remember the students, my peers, when we were giving this presentation, absolutely mesmerized, because for the first time they'd been taught about physiological changes in the body as a result of stress. And I still think that there's a lot of therapists still quite uninformed about how post-traumatic stress presents and the physiological changes of the body. And I think that although you don't have to change your practice too much, having some understanding of the physiological changes and being able to support your client when they're explaining that, so you have the understanding of what they're going through, that enhances empathy. And also the ability to maybe support with psychological education. You know, if someone's struggling to why something happened, why they reacted in a certain way, if you can fill that gap in, you're being of great service. But I don't know about you, Ken, but I thought it was really interesting that predominantly we're still teaching 20th century ideas.
Yeah, very, very much so. And it's interesting. So you're saying 7% of people said that they felt comfortable working with trauma presenting in the therapy room. And the truth is, you know, as counselors, as psychotherapists, the one thing we know for sure is that trauma is going to present in the therapy room. It's an absolute given. We're very grateful to you, Rory. I mean, I know that you did some after you graduated as a counsellor, you went and trained in trauma therapy to be able to hold those clients. And you've gone on to create an exceptional course in Counselling Tutor on trauma-informed practice, which is incredibly well received by those that take it. And, you're speaking about it being beyond a theory and beyond that it is physiological, that it is felt in the body. And I know that is one of the reasons why you built the live element into the training, as opposed to sitting there, reading documents, looking at research, watching a video of somebody telling you about it. Those live elements is where it really comes to life. And that's what we hear from the students that take that training, of seeing and feeling how to implement this knowledge is all important. And I think I'd like to start with, you're talking about that PTS, that post-traumatic stress. I think that it is sometimes, it certainly was by me, it was misunderstood. I thought that would only occur in an ex-serviceman, somebody who had been in a incredibly horrific, pressured situation and seen atrocities. But it's not so. This post-traumatic stress can come about from our daily activities. And when I learned more about how it shows and what it really is, I can recognize it in myself. I can recognize it from my childhood. I can recognize it arising from interactions that I had at school. It's there and it's real. And, if we're not able to see and we're not able to recognize, how can we meet our clients when they're presenting with this, Rory?
Absolutely. And I think you've hit on a very important idea here, Ken, that post-traumatic stress is something that our servicemen and women, our military personnel engage with, and indeed they do. But just to think of it in those terms, in that aspect, I think dismisses the huge amounts of people who have post-traumatic stress for very ordinary things. I'll share an example. On Wednesday, I'm going to the dentist. And without wanting to kind of upset anybody who might have had the same experience as me, trigger them, at 67, dentistry when I was a child was not the kindly, thoughtful, and well-developed practice it is now. It was pretty brutal. And to be honest, every time I have to go to the dentist, I have to do a lot of grounding work with myself and some techniques that I use to stop me going into a full-blown panic attack, which might seem really ridiculous for 67-year-old therapist, but that's how it feels. And I've done a lot of work. I've worked with colleagues who've given me some really good strategies, and that can happen. And we talked at the top of the podcast about the difference between PTSD and CPTS, or D. I'm going to leave the D in. It's a bit confusing, isn't it, when you use acronyms. And the continuous, or the compounded stress, was something that was identified by Judith Herman, very famous, I think, American trauma specialist, and she saw that in service personnel who'd been in encounter after encounter. So CPTS is where somebody has a number of traumatic events. So I mentioned service personnel, fell into my own trap there, really. That could be someone who's had multiple instances of abuse or multiple traumatic experiences. And that is really does compound the trauma, and needs to be very, very thoughtful about when you're working with it, because that could be quite devastating. I have a very good friend who's a trauma expert, who's really, really good at working with young children, and her practice is completely shaped completely differently to anybody's practice at all, because it is trauma informed. It comes from that position. It has other elements that she was taught during the arc of her training, but she's drawn a lot on trauma-informed practice and the physiology of trauma to support her clients. So it's really a fast-moving field. You think of the authors, Bessel van der Kolk, who comes in, and all the other famous writers who are now talking about the physiological aspects of trauma.
Yeah, felt within the body, and if we look to PTS, we're talking symptoms of re-experiencing, avoiding those triggers at all costs, even at the detriment of self, a sense of threat or dread within those situations. And you mentioned right at the top of this that you get triggered in that way when it comes to going to the dentist. And a little bit of other theory there. You also said, at the risk of triggering others. And this is a tricky topic. When we are speaking about traumatic events, there is that risk of triggering others, and of course, vicarious or indirect trauma is a way of kind of describing that. And I'm very grateful that I have here on hand not Rory's encyclopedic brain to be able to speak about this. I've got the super duper handout here, so I've got the cheat sheet, as it were. And speaking about that compounding, I can certainly relate to that. Certainly from client work, and I'm thinking, and I'm gonna go to the dentist because we've said the dentist, and just incidentally, just out of pure coincidence, today I've got a dental appointment, and similarly, it's not something that I enjoy at all, and I try and avoid even thinking about it, but it's something I've got to go into today. So, just using that as an example, you were speaking about how, when we went into this, how a therapist comes out of training maybe ill-prepared in this area. And I'm thinking, as a purely person-centered therapist graduating, and a client coming in mentioning about their absolute fear of going into the dentist but having to go in, sitting in an empathic way and kind of reflecting that back to them is not going to be effective treatment. And we're not best serving our clients if we don't know that. And I think it's so important, and I'm glad that we're raising this topic because I think it raises the awareness. And moreover, you're not going to be able to listen to this podcast topic and go, right, that's it, now I understand trauma, I've gone and downloaded Rory's super duper handout. I think if anything, it's about knowing what we don't know. Yeah. And realizing that there is a training need there. And there's lots of training out there. There's not us punting our training courses. There's lots of training out there. But the message is, do that training, because trauma does and has and will continue to come into your therapy room. And it's a presentation that needs care and understanding, Rory.
Yeah, and I think that I'll throw another theory in here, the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is a psychological theory that says people can sometimes overstate their confidence in things. So because they may not know things, but they might believe they know things. And I'll give you a concrete example of that. In the training, there's a clip of a video. It's a still from a video of a police officer in America giving a lecture on safe handling of firearms to students. And he said, and I quote, "I am the only person who can use this weapon. I'm the only person trained to use this weapon." And he then proceeded to shoot himself in the foot, discharge his weapon because he'd left some ammunition in it. And, if we think about what we don't know and hoping that, thinking we know things when we don't, and then trying to work with clients, it can be quite detrimental. And trauma-informed practice doesn't make you a trauma expert. What it makes you is informed, so that you can work with a client, and when they bring something up, you could draw on that knowledge and maybe respond in a different aspect or move in a different direction. Or even in some cases where somebody comes and it's really, really affecting their lives, you could use the background knowledge to be able to write a referral and be able to draw on what you know to support a client, perhaps getting a different form of support. And I think you're right, Ken. I think that trauma presented itself when I was a student. I didn't know it as trauma because it was never, I was never taught that. It was only when I did my research in the second year that some of the ideas that I'd researched, or we'd researched, myself and Jonathan had researched, had informed my practice. And I think also, as the years went on, I look back at my practice and think, if I'd have known then what I know now, and you should never really look back in this way because you can't know what you don't know. If I'd have known now what I know, known then what I know now, I wonder if I'd have been a better service, and I think I would have been a better service having taken the trauma informed course. I would say it's an epidemic, Ken. I was a school counsellor for years, and I worked with trauma in school counsellor. I worked as a private practitioner, and I came across trauma there. I worked for a charity for quite a long time after I qualified, and that was a presentation not only in my therapy room but in others. And we only have to sit around and have a coffee and have a chat to colleagues, and it's not long before trauma comes up. So I do think there is value in understanding the physiological. This is the key thing: the physiological aspects of trauma, something that we're not really taught in an experiential course.
Yeah, and we can end this with the opening to the Super Duper handout, and it's a quote of Gabor Mate, where he says, "Trauma is not what happens to you; it's what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you." There it is. So we've got that Super Duper handout for you. It's called Distinguishing Between PTS and Complex PTS, and you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. That's our website. Click on the podcast tab. Today's episode is 329. Make your way to 329. You can do a search for that, and you can download this handout. It covers the different types of trauma, the 4 main types of trauma. It gives different levels of stress response that you may encounter in your practice. It speaks about PTS versus CPTS. It goes right into detail on that. And then the International Trauma Questionnaire, the ITO, is covered. And then working with CPTS, what the kind of strategies are for working with that. And what I really like about it, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 references, 10 references at the end of this handout, where you can dive a lot deeper into this all important topic. And of course, if you are considering training as a trauma informed therapist and you are interested in looking at the Counselling Tutor training, go to counsellingtutor.com, just click on our trainings and it's right there for you. And that is today's ethical, sustainable practice. And we now move on to Practice Matters, the interview section where we bring in experts in their field. We always called this the CPD section. You can pop it down on your CPD recording sheet because you're listening to an expert and thinking how that can be applied to practice. And this one, very interesting and very important, navigating complaints. And you met up with Susie Jamieson on this, Rory.
Yeah, Susie's been recently quite a regular guest on the podcast, and she did a 2-part discussion on her own experience of navigating a complaint. She's done a fabulous lecture for the CPD library on how to navigate complaints. As we always say, hope for the best and plan for the worst. And Susie Jamieson joins us to discuss some of the aspects of this really important lecture to get you ready to think about how you might manage your complaint. I caught up with her, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Our guest today is no stranger to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, having previously joined us on episodes 319 and 320 to discuss her personal experiences and managing a complaint, and again on episode 323 where she shared her views on regulation. She's back with us today to introduce a valuable resource she has created to help practitioners be complaint ready. So it's a big welcome back to Susie Jamieson.
Well, it's lovely to be back, Rory. Thank you for having me.
Now, the reason that you're back is that, as I mentioned, you did a two-part interview on the complaints process you went through, and that's led you to become known as the complaints counsellor. And you produced 3 lectures, not 1 lecture for our CPD library, but 3 on complaints. So straight off the bat, why is it important that anybody who's a member of the CPD library watches your lecture? Why is it important?
Well, the first one that's important, Rory, is the be complaint ready one. That's if you ignore the other 2 classes, watch the be complaint ready. None of us can ever really predict if we're going to be complained about or not. And the trouble is, if you listen to podcast 319 and 320, you'll hear the horror story. It hits you like a comet. It really does. It blindsides you. And if you're prepared and you understand what's ahead of you, oh my gosh, it just makes such a difference.
Yes. And we have an old saying in Counselling Tutor, we hope for the best but prepare for the worst. And it sounds very much like this is what you're saying. You cannot go through your life as a therapist believing that you'll never get complained about. I've met people who've had complaints put against them, and they said, I never thought I'd be complained about in a million years. Just isn't something on people's radar.
It's not. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think we have a tendency to bury our head in the sand and hope that it won't ever happen to us, and rightly so. But also the complaint is often, not always, but it's often about the client. And it's not something that we can predict. But I think being ready for any big event in life helps us get through it if it happens.
Yes, and that's what I took away. I was having a look at the slides this morning from your first lecture, and it struck me that this is a really useful lecture to watch, just to take our heads out of the sand. And I use our heads collectively. I'm not in practice anymore, but it doesn't mean that I can't have a complaint levied against me. Take your head out of the sand, to be blunt, and watch that lecture so that you're ready. Because in my experience, when people get traumatic news, if they're not prepared for it, they can really, really struggle. They've got nothing to fall back on. That's the
Absolutely.
issue.
Yeah. When something like this happens, we've got our cognitive functioning, which is our problem solving and our thinking. And then we've got the emotional aspect of our brain. Can't remember what it's called, but it doesn't matter. It's not a physiological lesson. And, the emotional one gets dialed right up and our cognitive functioning gets dialed down. And so it's really hard to understand what's happening, be objective. We are drowning in the emotion of it.
Yeah. And I guess we don't make the best decisions when we're in that brain space. The idea of the cognitive is to look at things logically and to be able to put, plans in place, enact kind of your training and start to engage with the difficulty. But in the emotional place, I guess you're in fight, or freeze, aren't you? You're going to be in one of those.
Oh, you're definitely going to have a threat response, because on the line then becomes your career, your reputation, your sense of self. I mean, it doesn't matter how we look at being a therapist. We are our brand. We are the service product. We are our services. So when somebody comes in and officially complains, they are saying this human being is dreadful.
And that can't be easy to hear for someone who's spent a lot of time investing themselves in being a therapist to help others. I think that's the double blow, isn't it? You know, if you've spent lots of time and you have a vocational heart, and then to receive a complaint can be, I think it can be a bit of a double whammy.
It's a several whammy. There's many aspects to it, and one of them is the betrayal. You know, you think you have a good relationship with the client, and I had a great relationship with the person that complained about me. And going through your mind was that relationship false? Was it never real? Was it never what I felt it was, or what I sensed it was, or what the feedback told me it was? And you question everything. And then doubt creeps into all your other client work, unfortunately. Everything. You question everything.
So there's a second guessing that you go through once you've received a complaint. Every other client, you're wondering, are they going to complain about me?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I used to go through phases of fear, real fear. And, you know, I was extremely lucky that I had such an amazing supervisor who I'd worked with I still work with her, I've worked with for a very long time. So she was able to reassure me and say, but Susie, what about this? And Susie, what about that? Because you can get it's like being a rabbit in the headlights. Like, you know, that fear, that threat, the anxiety, and then there's the lower emotional experiences of shame as well. And you live and experience this day after day after day.
So that's the even bigger reason to be prepared, have some sort of fallback plan, something that you can see, you can rehearse in your mind, and then you can kick that in. It's second nature. You just kick it in, and although the emotional stuff is going on, you're doing practical things to support yourself and to I guess, if it's a vexatious complaint, not all complaints are vexatious, as we've seen recently, but if it is a vexatious complaint, to be able to form some form of defence against that.
Yes. And, you know, there's a lot of operational stuff that happens. And, you know, the things that I talk about are call your solicitor, call your insurance company. They will give you a solicitor. Make sure that you speak to your supervisor. I mean, they are the critical calls you need to make. Your membership body already knows. You don't have to call them because they're telling you about the complaint. Excuse me. But please do call your insurance and speak to your supervisor because you need them. You really need them.
Yeah, and we would expect our insurance companies to be very capable in this area. After all, you pay them a fee, and you know part of their offer, certainly my insurance company, is that they will provide you with legal cover. And certainly, I've never had a complaint levied against me, but when I had to send my notes in with the client's permission a good few years ago because there was a court case, and they were very interested about what was happening. They kept in touch with me. She was making a allegation against a third party. However, they did keep in touch with me. So you kind of expect them to be competent. But I wonder, is it a time thinking about complaints to think about how does your supervisor, what would your supervisor do? Have you had that conversation with your supervisor about how to work with a complaint should you get one? And it might be that when you do, you find out that perhaps they don't know too much about it.
You have touched on such a huge point here, Rory. So thank you for raising it. My next lecture or my next workshop is specifically for supervisors, helping them to be complaint ready for their supervisees. I did some questioning of people who have been trained to be supervisors, and I specifically asked what was covered in terms of complaints and how to support your supervisees. And so far, I'm not saying none of the training bodies do this, but so far, zero. And I thought, oh my goodness gracious, what would my experience have been like for me if my supervisor hadn't actually had experience of working with, interestingly, 2 other people who'd gone through a complaint. So as soon as I told her, she was able to tell me about what would likely happen. And when you hear it'll probably take a year and a half, I mean, literally, I think my chin hit my ankles. I couldn't think about that length of time. As it turned out, it was 16 months, but there we go. So I am putting together a piece of work to help supervisors support their supervisees through a complaint.
Yes, and I think that, you know, if you are offering supervision, it's really important that you understand not only the impact that a complaint can have on a supervisee, and the total devastation it can bring, but also to be able to offer that very, you know, we talk about the formative, normative, and restorative in supervision, and the formative is effectively information, losing the name, information, and by giving information and giving some structure within supervision, it can be just so helpful, can't it? It can be so helpful. Was that your experience with your supervisor?
Yeah, my supervisor was incredible. And we still talk about it. I mean, this complaint came in 4 years ago. We still talk about it because it does still affect my work. There is a lot of unseenness in the whole of the complaints process. And if I was going to criticize a membership body, I would say, please be more transparent about the process, the impact on therapists. There's a lot of documented stages and steps, and you know the worksheet instructions, if you like, but the actual impact on a therapist is really not spoken about. And that's what as you know, that's my quest, is to aim to open up our minds to what actually happens. But you know, I don't know about other supervisors because I consider myself to be incredibly lucky. But there will be a lot of supervisors out there who don't know a therapist who's been complained about. They've not been complained about themselves. And a supervisor rocks up and says, I've got a complaint. There's a little bit of fragility and uncertainty going on there. And that's not a criticism. I think it's important that the training organisations start to include this, particularly with the rise in complaints.
Yes.
You know, it'll be hitting 1% this year, I'm sure, or very, very close to 1%. That's a lot of people.
It is.
A lot of people.
It is. And I also think that if someone isn't ready to be able to work with a supervisee who's had a complaint against them, they may also go into the more emotional side of the brain and not be able to provide that kind of regulation that's so important that supervisors offer as a modelling to supervisees. You know, they may go into panic mode as well, and then you have 2 people panicking, and that's never a good thing, is it?
No, it wouldn't be. And there's also, you know, it's a time for personal therapy as well. So a supervisor may say to the supervisee, well, you know, you need to take all of this to personal therapy. But does the therapist have the experience? And I know that's not as essential as perhaps it is in supervision. But from my own experience of looking for a therapist, I couldn't find anybody to work with me when I was going through the complaint. It took me 2 years to find a therapist. And by that time, fortunately, the complaint had finished. But, you know, that has always been a great source of concern to me. So I think we all of us need to be more complaint aware.
Yes, which is the purpose of your lecture.
Yeah.
I mean, you go through it in great depth. You share a lot of your story, which I think is very, very useful. But you also provide very practical based information. And I want to pick up on what you said. 1% doesn't sound like a lot, does it? If you think of 100
No.
things and 100 apples, and one of them is bad, you wouldn't think too much about it. But actually, for the person who gets that bad apple, it's a complete and utter disaster. The only thing you're going to eat in a day is an apple, and it's a bad one, and you've got the 100th one that is. So it really is important that I guess just like data protection, it's one of those things that people perhaps don't want to get involved with. It's like eating your vegetables. Eat your vegetables. I'd rather do the theory, the meat, the nice stuff, of theory or practice. But it's essential that therapists are prepared in every area of their life, isn't it?
Totally. Because, we go back to that, how our brain processes shocks and threats. And this is a big threat because if you don't know what's ahead of you, you genuinely don't know what's ahead of you. And you can't really fully predict it anyway, because every complaint is different. Every scenario is different. But understanding the process, knowing what you need to do, knowing what you can do, knowing how to look after yourself, knowing it's going to take time. This is not going to be over and done with in a couple of weeks, if only. And so being aware so that when a complaint lands, you go, okay, I remember that lecture. I remember talking to Susie. I remember going to one of her workshops. I remember this. Right. Okay. This is what I need to do.
Yes.
And I also offer drop-in sessions for therapists so that they can just come and have one session. We talk about it and they can go and get on with their operational stuff for their complaint. And then they'll come back again when they're on to the next stage. That's all good. I don't expect them to, come in for a long-term therapeutic agreement, but it's helpful to have somebody who's got the lived experience, who totally understands it, to talk to. Yes.
So I guess that one call to action would be, if you are a member of the CPD library, go and watch this lecture. This is Rory telling you, go and watch this lecture, because you may be one of those one in 100 people who have a complaint levied against you. And I think it's fair to say that, not all complaints are vexatious. Professional bodies have an obligation to the general public to protect the general public. And, as we've seen with the Allergena case that's come up in the media, a very high profile case, that was clearly a case where there was no defence for what the therapist did to this poor woman. And it took 6 years for her to get a legal remedy to it. But, I have talked to a lot of therapists through the years who've had rather, I would say, surprising complaints levied against them for very surprising things.
Yes.
And none of them which I would have thought, as someone who's been doing this for a long time, been involved in education and training and practice and supervision, would have thought it would have got into a complaints panel, but it has.
Yeah. And this is why we need to be ready, because we don't know how the complaint is going to proceed. If it's clearly vexatious, like I can't stand the smell of my counsellor's perfume, I would hope and pray that would not get any further than, okay, we hear you, but we're not taking this any further.
Yeah.
But the whole area is incredibly subjective, and we have to remember that there are two people involved having a very, very different experience of the same thing.
Yes.
And so a client may feel very slighted, very abandoned, very rejected, very insulted, harmed, all sorts of things. But actually, that's not what actually happened. But without the witnesses to our work, we have virtually no, we have no witness.
Yes.
So it's all paper, they said, they did, I didn't, stories, really, that a panel of people need to sit down and say, but if what the complainant is saying is true, that's a breach of the ethical framework, or that's a breach of our professional standards, or there's a legal issue here. I mean, those are very rare, fortunately. The case you just mentioned, that clearly was a legal issue. And it's not then until the hearing happens, when everybody's gathered together, that you can hear the prosody and the voice and the tones and the body language and realise, oh, no terrible thing, no breach of ethics or breach of professional standards did actually happen. And quite often when people are complaining, they want acknowledgement that they feel they've been wronged, or they want an apology. And the one thing we can't give is the apology. And I think, sorry to all you membership bodies out there, I am going to speak my opinion, but I do believe that there needs to be another part up early on in the proceedings, whether that's the therapist and the complainant sit down with an independent supervisor or a mediator and see if it can be quashed at that point. And I don't mean quashed because that's the benefit for the therapist, but sometimes the complainant just wants, look, I felt that I was done wrong and I couldn't speak to my therapist because I just can't do that. So I needed to get someone else involved to help me.
Yes.
And they clearly, a lot of people don't realise actually what happens to a therapist when they're complained about. This isn't sending your suit back.
No. And you say that you can't apologise. Do you want to elaborate on that?
So if you apologise, you're admitting that you did wrong. So the consensual disposal part of the procedure isn't an apology per se, but it is okay, I did this, more or less. It's a little bit vague, so hear me out. Where the therapist is almost admitting and the complainant accepts that, the therapist recognises they did something inappropriate or made a mistake or whatever, and that usually brings the proceedings to a close. But if the complainant doesn't want to accept that, then the case would go forward to a hearing, and then you're in a hearing saying, I admit that, trying to say, but I didn't do it. And so solicitors are very, very, very cautious about apologies.
It's a double jeopardy situation.
It kind of is,
It kind of is, isn't it? And I'm sure professional bodies are here to defend themselves. And I suppose as a pseudo journalist, I need to say that they would probably say that their first duty is protection to the public.
Absolutely.
And if there is any professional bodies out there who'd like to come onto the podcast and talk about the complaints procedure and the transparency of it, I'd be delighted to interview you. Now, as we come to the end of our time together, Susie, what do you hope that anybody watching this series of 3 lectures, not 1, but 3 lectures, would take away after having watched them?
I hope that they will be ready for a complaint, whether they get one or a colleague gets one or a supervisee gets one. They've got the operational understanding of what lies ahead. I hope when they see my story that they can differentiate between the admin process, that's just a series of checks, assessments and decisions that operates on its own timeline. But there is a human being going through that process, and the ripple effects that go into their personal and professional lives are very individual. Mine was not the worst case. I say that often. It's a pretty bad one, but it's not the worst one. And then part 3 is all about, okay, so you've been through the process, whether you've been sanctioned or not, because many cases come to nothing, they just get dismissed. What do you want to do now? Have you been sanctioned so you can't work for a long period of time? I think the maximum now is, I'd like to think it's 18 months, but it might be longer. It used to be 5 years. So you can't work as a therapist. What are you going to do? And what do you need to do to actually rejoin your membership body? Because other membership bodies generally don't take you at that point. Are you going to come back into counselling? Are you going to leave your career? Or is there something else that you can do that sort of blends therapy and some other service, like you might be able to be a key worker somewhere or something like that? So I think what I tried to put together was be ready. It may never happen. That's okay. But you might hear about somebody that it does happen to. Understand what therapists go through so that if somebody comes to you for therapy going through a complaint, or you get a supervisee, you understand the devastation, the ripple effects. And then part 3 is all about, okay, so what is next? What's your recovery plan? Because it breaks my heart that people leave their profession because one person complained about them. I mean, I nearly did several times. When you see my story, you'll see that it really is quite heartbreaking at times. I don't want therapists thinking about suicide. I don't want them thinking about having to leave their career. We need to do more to safeguard. We do an awful lot of work about safeguarding our clients. We're vulnerable too. We need to safeguard each other.
Well, I think on those wise words, Coping with Complaints, a 3-part lecture series by Susie Jamieson, is available in the Counsellor CPD library now to view. Please go and watch it. As we've said, there is an urgency there. If you remember, please go and watch it. And it just goes for me to say, Susie Jamieson, thank you so much for joining us again.
Massive thank you to Susie Jamieson. Thank you to you, Rory, for holding those all-important conversations. That was Practice Matters, and we now head right into Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting, and it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. And today in Student Services, we recognise you, your students, on your formal journey to become a counsellor, to become a psychotherapist. And one of the things that can make the blood run cold is when you're asked to do an observed skill session, or just really the overwhelm that can come when thinking about skills session. And of course, skills is where the theory is kind of interwoven into the skills, but they're a set of skills that we use when we're in a room with a client. It can be it can bring up a little bit of anxiety, Rory.
It can, and this is really a direct response to a person who wrote about this in our Facebook group. And I can clearly remember on my introduction course, my first skill session, and I was the proverbial deer in the headlights. I didn't do very well at all. I left the encounter thinking maybe I should have done the plumbing course. Maybe I should have signed up for the plumbing or the electric course, because this was going to be quite a difficult skill for me to get. And, through the years, I've observed not only myself as I went through my own arc of training, but also students who really, really struggle. And I think part of the struggle, Ken, I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, but I think that a lot of students put pressure on themselves. They think they have to get it right first time. And I think, and you're the best person to speak about this because you are, the person whose passion is counselling skills. But I think it's about developing and being a bit forgiving of yourself in using skills, because like any skill, we could set off on one path and may find that actually we're not quite in the right direction. We may have to do something else. We may have to use a different approach, and I think it can be very stressful. In fact, I would say, from my teaching experience, that students get more stressed. There's more stress levels over observed skills practice than there is about just Q&A about theory or triads or even PD, if I'm honest, personal development groups. What's your thoughts, Ken?
Yeah, very much so. I concur, Rory. We certainly saw that when we were teaching side by side. And it's like doing a speech, I think, where you feel that you're standing up in front of an audience and having to deliver something. And it can feel like that if you're doing a simulated skills session and you have some form of observation. And that can be a recorded observation that you have to hand in, or it could be a physical observation where the person is actually watching you either online or they're in the room with you. And it feels a bit put on. And the reason for that is because it is. Yeah. It is staged. You know, I can't think of anything that is more removed from reality than a simulated observed skill session when you think about how it really is with a client. Because with a client, you're flowing, you're connected, you're there with that person, and you're responding to what they bring within that moment. However, we have to evidence that we know how to use the skills appropriately at the right time and in service of our clients. So we have to go through this process of some form of observed skills session. So I think the first thought around overcoming the anxiety that may sit around this is to know that it is just that. It's a manufactured situation that you are in. It's not a reflection on your real skills. And I see often in our Facebook group where maybe an observed skill session has been done and a student has received some feedback on that of what they might improve on that, and it can be devastating. I don't have the skills to be client facing, and it's not true. No. You know, the role of a tutor is to give us that feedback and to guide us and to help us develop in certain areas. So the one thing I would say is recognize it for what it is, which is a setup scenario. I remember when I did mine, I even said that at the very beginning in my contracting. I said, I recognize that this is a setup session and that there is a third person watching this, and it, because it was exactly how it was. The second thing, and I think this is really important, is practice makes perfect. It really does. And in any good counseling training course, you will be given many, many opportunities to practice your skills, where there may be an hour where the tutor might say, now break up into pairs or triads and go and do skills practice. Use that time wisely. It's very easy to maybe be in a room on your own or in a corner on your own with a peer to kind of wander off and start speaking about things that are not the skills. Use that time wisely. Every opportunity you have to do a simulated skill session during your training, think of it as an observed skill session and be your best within it, because that's practice. And all you're doing then, when it does come to the observation, is exactly what you've done dozens and dozens and dozens of times before. Any thoughts on that, Rory?
Yeah, I mean, I think we used to encourage our students, Ken, to read biographies. Put the academic textbooks down that talk about how to use skills. There's lots of them. I know Ken's written one, but put those books down for a time. Read a biography. Someone that you admire. Could be a sports person. Could be anybody. And when people write in their own words, they write with emotion. And when you're reading a piece of that book, stop as you read a paragraph and try and reflect back the emotion that person has written in, and just say it out loud. You can sit in a room and just say, feels like you felt defeated at that time, or it feels like you didn't really want to go on, or what was it that stopped you doing that? Or you could ask a question. I've read this, but I'm not sure I understand who you're referring to. And if you get into that idea of responding to text, it becomes a lot easier to respond to the real thing, because first of all, you haven't got a real person in front of you. And secondly, you can play with your responses. You can play with it because the book is not got a time boundary to it. You can play with your responses. Yes, you're not going to get feedback from anybody, but I think it's an interesting way of doing it. And a lot of the students that we taught love the idea of that. It worked very well. And I do think that the exam board that we work with wanted, I think it was 5 skills demonstrated. I don't know about you, Ken, but in a half an hour engagement with a client, I'm not sure that I have ever levered in 5 counselling skills. I think that the biggest skill I ever used was silence, just allowing the client to speak. I think it really is tricky. It speaks to what you say, Ken, about it being a bit of a, I don't know what to say this, a bit of a setup, maybe.
Well, it is. That's exactly, you're 100% right there, Rory. And, the reason, and this, I think what's important as well, when you're going into your observed skill session, is know what the criteria is. What are you being marked on? Because you can have a really good, empathic, deep session and be pulled up and not and referred on your skill session if you're not hitting the criteria. Yeah. So have a look and understand the criteria. I'm going to give you an example of a criteria, but you need to look to yours. The criteria that I worked to was they wanted to see the topping and the tailing of the session. And in the topping of the session, the kind of intro, they wanted to hear things like how much time there was within the session. They wanted to hear where I would need to break confidentiality according to the law. And within and there was some other stuff there as well, of course, but in the tailing of the session, they were looking for that, okay, we've got about 5 minutes left now, because each one of those is a little tick and it's a hitting of criteria. And if there is a requirement to use 5 different skills, if you know this going in, then you can be prepared. Silence. So if you know what your skills are, it's always a good idea to have the skills written down on a piece of paper, what the different skills are and what they do. Silence, one skill. A reflection, when the client brings something and you parrot back in their words what they have just said to you. You're probably going to have a summary at the end where you kind of bring together what they've brought within their session. There's 3 for free before you even bring in any other the skills, maybe a non-directive question. So have a think about what the criteria is asking of you. And because it is a setup, go in with the aim of hitting those criteria, not delivering a deep, meaningful, life-changing skill session, because that's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen because of the nature of the fact that it's being watched. It's difficult for the speaker to bring anything that is going to be of deep meaning. Record your skills if you can. Can, when you're working with your peers, and you're doing those simulated skill sessions, if you can, gain the permission that nothing deep is going to be brought, and that you can record that session, record it. And the recording devices back in our day, Rory, I remember when you introduced the recordings, there were these big microphones that you'd put on the desk that were connected to these tape recorders. Nowadays, of course, you've got portable recorders and even a phone if you're just doing it for your own use in a simulated skill session, and then go and listen back to it.
Yes.
And if you've got that criteria of what you need to hit in your final skills observation, ask yourself, am I hitting those? Do I hear 5 different skills? Did I cover the top and tailing as is required? And you can kind of self-crit your skills practice makes perfect. But here's the thing I can share with you. If you are a caring, empathic individual, when you get out and your clients are there, if you know your theory, you understand the skills, you'll see that it all falls into place and it all comes together. And there is a time not very far away from right now where you won't be thinking, am I using the skill, or what skill do I use here? It will just come naturally, and it will come from your inner self in service of that client.
It's true. And we don't want to be too tough on exam bodies and tutors, because you have to assess somehow. And, courses run in a time frame that's fixed. So I think we have to kind of admit that sometimes areas of training aren't ideal, but they have to evidence that you have a competence. But as Ken said, you find that once your practice has matured, you're probably not going to be the same user of skills that you were in your student days. It's going to be probably completely different to when you practice. So it's like with any skill, you develop it. You develop it as you go, and you develop it with the client you have. I think that's the other thing that we've not discussed. You're working usually with your peers when you're doing a recorded skills session, and that's not a real client. It is a piece of theatre, really, as opposed to a therapeutic engagement. And I think everybody knows that. But my final thoughts on it are: just be yourself. Just if you've got to the period of training where you are using skills, you're going to be pretty committed to helping others. And I think just don't be too hard on yourself. Just take it easy on yourself.
Indeed, there's no secret that I really enjoy skills. It's a passion of mine. The book that Rory mentioned is Basic Counselling Skills, a Student Guide. It is available on Amazon. It's got some download audio files as well where you can hear the skills in action. And I set up a little side project called Counselling Skills Academy, where peers get together, study skills, and we kind of do work together to practice those skills. If you're interested, you can have a look at that. But this has been Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 329, and we're grateful you joined us.
We are grateful you joined us, and we start with ethical sustainable practice, PTS brackets D versus CPTS brackets D. The difference between post-traumatic stress and compounded post-traumatic stress or continuous. And we talked about, I had a discussion about the differences of how post-traumatic stress appears, and also the physiological presentation of it. In ethical sustainable practice, I caught up again with a wonderful guest, Susie Jamieson, who talked us through a wonderful lecture she has in the CPD library on how to navigate complaints. A must listen to lecture to get you ready for if you may get a complaint. If you've listened to Susie Jamieson's other discussions, you'll know how stressful a complaint can be. But if you're prepared, that will reduce or may be able to make that process just a little bit easier. And then finally, Ken and myself had a bit of a noodle around handling overwhelm in skills session. We had a bit of a chat about the back and forth of skills and how some students may get very, very stressed out when using skills practice, and just to be a bit thoughtful for yourself and not to get too stressed out about it. Now, before we sign off, there's a little bit of news, incredible news really. We've just discovered that our podcast has been ranked number 2 worldwide on FeedSpot's list of 15 best counselling podcasts. For nearly a decade, it's been honestly a real honour to bring you meaningful conversations, insights, and to offer what support we can to the counselling community. So we thank you for listening, we thank you for your sharing, and we thank you for the comments. Your support really means the world to myself and Ken. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.